Hello and welcome to week 4 of the 15th iteration of the Massive Open online course on digital currencies for the master's degree in digital currencies by the University of Nicosia. My name is Andreas M. Antonopoulos and I'll be your teacher answering your questions from last week's material. Week 4 is about Bitcoin in practice, Bitcoin in action, and we're talking a lot about wallets. And fortuitously, just today, there's a big conversation going on about paper wallets online because a well-known paper wallet site has proven to be backdoored and compromised, causing substantial losses of money for people using that obsolete technology. As you probably remember, that was one of the areas in your material from last week where there is a very big red-lettered warning that says do not use paper wallets. And now you can see exactly why. Despite the warnings, despite the repeated warnings, people still use this obsolete technology. And we're going to talk a bit about that and answer many of your questions today. All right, we'll start off with a question from Glenn. Glenn asks about seed phrases and stolen wallets. How exactly does a seed phrase backup work? If a wallet's private key is stolen and the owner tries to recover their wallet using their seed phrase, does this trigger anything on the blockchain to prevent access with the stolen private keys? Follow-up. Once wallet access is compromised, should it be discarded and a new one created, or is there any way of secure wallet recovery? All right, Glenn, that's an excellent question to get us started. So let me explain how this works. Private keys are numbers. Think of them as a PIN number that allows you to prove you own Bitcoin to the blockchain by creating digital signatures, which are also numbers derived from that PIN number. Now, as a PIN number, it's a very long 77-digit PIN number if you wrote it down in decimal. So a very, very long secret private number. A mnemonic backup phrase, or seed phrase as it's often known, 12 to 24 English words most commonly, is simply an encoding of another number that is used to generate many private keys. So a seed phrase is an encoding in English words of a number. That number allows you to calculate multiple private keys. In fact, billions of private keys in a sequence that is specific to that backup phrase. So this information isn't stored anywhere. This isn't a password that gives access to an account. This isn't some mechanism for accessing an account on the blockchain. The backup phrase itself is a number from which, through an arithmetic formula, other numbers that are your private keys are generated on your local computer, specifically and preferably on a hardware wallet that is a very secure device for doing precisely that. So your hardware wallet, or perhaps on a less secure basis, maybe for petty cash use, a software wallet, has generated a random number that it's encoded as this backup phrase of English words, and from that, it can then derive a series of private keys, which are like your PIN numbers that allow you to access specific amounts of Bitcoin that correspond to those. Each private key produces an address, etc., etc. So now let's think of this question through. If a wallet which contains a seed on it, a backup mnemonic phrase, or a set of private keys is stolen and compromised, someone is able to access it. Now, normally these devices are PIN protected. You can't access them even if you steal the device. But let's assume you stole it in such a way that you have the PIN number. And you're able to access it. So that means that the attacker has the private keys. They have access to either the specific numbers that unlock Bitcoin, the private keys, or they have access to the seed phrase itself somehow, and they can generate all of the other numbers. Now, if you take your backup and you use it to generate those same numbers on another device, does that notify the blockchain? No. You have your PIN numbers, they have your PIN numbers. And at that point, whoever gets a transaction signed first gets to spend the money. So you cannot cancel a private key. You cannot deactivate a private key or a Bitcoin address. And so if someone has knowledge of the PIN number of the private key, they can essentially access that Bitcoin, as can you. That's the same reason why you can have your mnemonic phrase recovered and installed on multiple wallets simultaneously. And all of those wallets will be able to see the same amounts on the Bitcoin blockchain or other blockchains. If you have a multi-currency wallet, they will be able to sign transactions and spend. All of them will be independently able to do that because they have the numbers, they have the PIN numbers, and with those they can construct transactions and produce digital signatures to authorize spending from those keys. So you can have an unlimited number of copies of the PIN number, of the backup phrase, and anyone with access to that can generate a spending transaction. Of course, once they've generated and broadcast a spending transaction to pay themselves or pay a friend, that money is no longer available for you to generate a spending transaction. So yes, that's how it works. So the follow-up question, once a wallet access is compromised, should it be discarded and a new one created, or is there any way of secure wallet recovery? And I believe we've already answered that question. Since you don't know if the wallet that was stolen from you can be broken into and the keys extracted. Now, these devices are designed to prevent that. They have PIN numbers that erase the system or make it impossible to retry without a very long delay. So it's not easy to get in, but it's also not impossible. You can't guarantee it's impossible. So if I had one of my hardware wallets stolen or lost, what would I do? I would use the backup mnemonic phrase to recover those keys onto a new device or application. I would then create a new seed that I would back up as a mnemonic phrase with a new set of keys that only I have. And then I would use the old keys, the old seed, to generate a spending transaction, a sweep transaction if you like, that moves all of the funds off the old keys that I consider potentially compromised, and I send all of those with an on-chain transaction to an address controlled by my new keys that I am guaranteed only I have access to. And that's the recovery process you would do. So if you suspect theft or compromise or loss of your backup phrase, or of a device that contains that backup phrase and can generate keys, it is the best scenario, it's the best practice to immediately sweep all of those funds so as to avoid potential compromise of the device. All right, our next question is the difference between 12 and 24-word mnemonic phrases. Songran asks, what is the difference between 12 and 24 mnemonic phrases in terms of security? Well, a 12-word mnemonic phrase produces 128 bits of entropy, 128 bits of entropy. A 24-word mnemonic phrase produces 256 bits of entropy. They have some additional bits in there for a checksum to make sure you can't mistype or have a corrupted mnemonic phrase, but the actual amount of entropy, of randomness, of number that is in there is 128 bits for 12 words and 256 bits for 24 words. Now, you might think, okay, well, obviously we'd use 256 bits. Turns out that's not necessarily the best practice anymore. A couple of things that you need to keep in mind is that when you generate a seed and a series of private keys, which are Bitcoin 256-bit private keys, Bitcoin private keys actually only use effectively 128 bits of entropy. If you have more entropy than that, if you have more randomness than that, it's kind of wasted. The actual entropy of a 256-bit key on the elliptic curve is about 128 bits of entropy. Therefore, many wallet manufacturers are now defaulting to 12 words. Why? 24 is unnecessary. If you are using the mnemonic phrase to do other fancy things, specifically there are some new standards for generating entropy from a mnemonic phrase. I'm not going to go into that. It's a very, very edge case and it doesn't really matter. If what you're using your backup mnemonic phrase is to generate keys on a hardware wallet for Bitcoin and other currencies, then 128 bits is all you need. And from a practical perspective, backing up 24 words is at least twice as hard as backing up 12. You certainly can't memorize them, but you probably shouldn't be doing that anyway. But it's also much more difficult. You have to record more information. If something is damaged, it's easier to damage and lose a 24-word mnemonic phrase. And what you're doing there is you're producing 256 bits of entropy, of which you're not going to use half of it. It's unnecessary. So this is why many of the existing hardware wallets now have defaulted to 12-word phrases. 128 bits of entropy is enough. Don't try to get fancy. Security is a process, and that process is about balancing different things, right? And if you make your own adjustments and don't follow the standards, you may not be aware of some of the trade-offs that you are making. Let me give you a practical real-world example. A battle tank has 3 inches of steel armor. Okay, great. Well, why just 3? Why not put 18 inches of steel armor on the tank? After all, if you put 18 inches, it's going to be that much more difficult to make a hole in it, right? Well, yes, but now it can't move. Now it's a sitting duck because it takes so much power to move the bloody thing, and you can't move it very fast. So, when someone's designing such a thing, they balance it between mobility and armor. You don't just put 18 inches of steel on it. You combine, find the best balance between the two. The same thing applies here. Yes, 24 words is more security, but if you're providing more security at the expense of the operational process of backup, you're making it less resilient. And more people, this is very important, pay attention now, more people lose money because of mistakes they make than from theft. So, for most people, the vast majority of people, making a mistake because you made things too complicated, because you deviated from the best practices, because you tried to get fancy with your keys, that's what's going to lose you money. And if you do that in order to prevent theft, you're making a very, very big mistake. Your first mistake, which is to deviate from best practices. And this is why I always recommend, keep it simple. Make backups. Keep the backups available. Make it simple. Use durable media to back up your mnemonic phrase, things like steel. Paper is good enough. Make a couple of copies. Okay, sure, but I would prefer to use a steel backup. Paper burns very easily, of course. And keep it at 12 words. That's enough. You don't need to go to 24. Another similar question from Claudio. How can I recover from a mnemonic phrase? Let's say I have a Ledger Nano that uses 24 words and I lose it. What are the steps? Can I use another wallet or should I buy another Ledger Nano? This is a very common question. The bottom line is this. All of the hardware wallets, or almost all of the hardware wallets, use the same standard. In fact, the best thing that we've done in this industry is standardized on one type of mnemonic phrase backup and one key derivation mechanism, which is BIP39 and BIP32. The reason this is important is because, as I mentioned before, newbies make mistakes that cause them to lose money at a far greater rate than they have their money stolen. So yes, you could do something else that is much more secure, but if you break the standardization, you make it harder for newbies to follow the steps. So there are, at last count, I think 40 or 50, maybe 60 different brands of hardware wallets. 99% of those use the same BIP39 mnemonic phrase standard, and you should buy the ones that use that standard unless you have a very special use case or want to deviate it for other reasons. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of software applications for software wallets also support the BIP39 mnemonic standard, and you can write it with a Python library in about 3 lines of Python code. It's not a magical recipe. You can recreate it from scratch if you absolutely had to and you're technically inclined, but literally there are thousands of pieces of software that can take 12 English words and produce the seed and necessary keys in a way that follows the standard. So you don't have to buy the same wallet. You don't have to buy the same hardware. You don't have to buy the same software. One little wrinkle that people run into, which is often problematic, is the issue of derivation paths. So as we've mentioned before, the mnemonic phrase is a seed. Now that seed plants a tree, and this tree has various branches, and each of these branches have keys on them. Now, when you recover the seed onto your hardware wallet and it grows the tree, it checks one branch and one branch only. Now, if your keys are not on this branch because the wallet that you created the seed put them on this branch, then when you recover it in a new wallet, it's going to look on this branch and it's going to say 0 money found. Your balance is 0. And you're like, oh no, I've lost my money. No, it's still there. You're just looking at this branch instead of that branch. And so you might think, well, can I just look at all of the branches? Well, yes, you can. The problem is there are 2 billion main branches plus 2 billion hardened branches on the first level, each of which splits into 2 billion branches and 2 billion hardened branches, each of which splits into 2 billion. You see where we're going with this, right? The numbers get impossible 3 steps in, 2 steps in really. And so you need to know which branch to look on. Fortunately, there are standards for that. 99% of wallets use the same basic branches. They use branch 44 for traditional legacy Bitcoin addresses that start with a 1. They use branch 49 for SegWit wrapped Bitcoin addresses that start with a 3. And they use branch 84 for SegWit native Bitcoin addresses that start with BC1. And then they use other branches for Ethereum, other branches for Ethereum Classic, for whatever else you might put on this particular tree. So you're not looking just randomly at any old branch of these 2 billion, but sometimes you might run into some problems when you recover. Most importantly, if you try to recover your backup mnemonic phrase and you don't find any money, do not panic. It's there. It's just on a different branch than the one that that particular wallet is looking at. And you might need to search a bit, but you will find it. It's not gone. Anna asks, I have seen a common theme in which people lacking basic knowledge are fearful of losing their assets due to the way they are currently purchased and stored. Thus, they make mistakes, losing the keys, writing down the wrong address, or misplacing their secure words. The result being people losing their money forever. Is this process something that you could see becoming more user-friendly in the future? Could we find a way that people become less fearful of having control over their assets? Absolutely, Anna. And unfortunately, the problem here is that you really only have two choices today. You have some form of self-custody where you control your keys, and you have the alternative where you give up that control to a third party. There's an in-between solution. Using multi-sig, you can have some of the keys yourself and some of the keys held by a third party, and that can be quite secure. Now, this is a problem that will have solutions, and these solutions are partly technology, but they're also partly operations and customer service and user interface design and good practices. And these are the kinds of solutions that the companies that make good solutions in this space will become very successful. So if you invent something that makes this process easier, then you can make a lot of money from users who can use this particular type of process. So there are a lot of opportunities to improve on these things. One of the proposed solutions that we're beginning to see in some other blockchains, of course, is what's called social recovery. And this is where you delegate recovery to a group of friends or trusted people. So you might have 10 people who you trust, and you might have a process whereby if you lose control of your keys, out of these 10 friends, if 5 of them come together or 3 of them come together, then they can initiate a recovery that maybe takes 90 days to protect you from them running away with your money and colluding. And once the 90-day freeze period is over, the money is recovered. Maybe it's recovered in such a way that you can regenerate your keys. And this is social recovery mechanism. You can think of it as a bit of multi-sig and some smart contracts and some operational process and a user interface wrapped around it. And we don't yet have these kinds of tools. But I certainly think these are the kinds of tools we're going to see in the future. Something that gives you control, but also prevents you from making catastrophic mistakes by giving you an out. Now, the nice thing about a social recovery scheme like that is that the people who have fragments of your keys don't need to know each other. In fact, it's better if they don't know who everyone is, although you would want to have some way of conveying that information to your heirs just in case something happens to you. So these are some of the ways we're going to see this space develop in the future, but keep in mind, before 2013, we didn't even have mnemonic phrases, hierarchical deterministic wallets, derivation, and multiple keys. We had single private key, single public key and address, and the best we could do with that was make a single key paper wallet, which is very, very risky and has all kinds of problems. As we saw today, one of the companies that makes those got compromised and backdoored, all kinds of mess. People lost hundreds of Bitcoins, but this is a recurring theme. So already, Anna, we're doing much better than we were in 2013 and 2014. The technology has advanced quite by leaps and bounds, but it does take time to develop the maturity of these things. Adam asks, is it a reasonable strategy to distribute a large number of coins across multiple wallets? Adam, honestly, no, it isn't. You're not increasing your security effectively by doing so, but you are decreasing your resilience. Yes, theoretically, if you have the keys spread across multiple wallets, if one of them is compromised, then the others are safe. But where are you backing them up? That means you're now backing them up and storing them in different locations. Otherwise, if you store them all in the same location, then if one of them is compromised, all of them are compromised. If you store them in multiple locations, now you need 2 locations per wallet minimum, plus that for every wallet you have, and potentially other technologies, optional passphrases, etc. Honestly, this isn't a very good idea. If you have that level of security requirement, you're better off doing something like a tiered multi-signature scheme. But, you know, there are plenty of people who store tens of millions of dollars on a single backup mnemonic phrase safely stored in multiple locations with just an optional passphrase. And that in itself, unless you are specifically targeted by a very, very well organized adversary, is sufficient. If you have a high profile in the industry and you're likely to be a target, you're going to go with some more sophisticated mechanisms. For example, using multisig and ensuring that the people who have these multisig keys will not reveal them with less than a 90-day back-off period and will immediately call the FBI because they'll assume you're kidnapped if you ask for a faster delivery of the funds. Hint, hint. Certainly that's something some of us have to do. But the bottom line is, for the average user, a single hardware wallet with a single backup mnemonic phrase backed up on steel in 2 locations that are secure is more than sufficient, is well balanced, is highly resilient, and you can store fairly large amounts of money on that in multiple currencies. Wendy has a follow-up question. How do you get the coins to your wallet? Do you just download it somewhere? You have, let's say, a hardware wallet, like a Ledger Nano, and you've bought coins on multiple platforms. Well, this is how you get them to your wallet. Now, keep in mind, wallets do not contain coins. Wallets contain keys. The coins are on the blockchain. Always. This is a very important thing to understand. Wallets are really just keychains. They're devices that generate, store keys and consign transactions with them. There are no coins on the wallet. We don't move coins in blockchains. What we do is we transfer ownership by recording transactions on the ledger that show that the amount that was owned before is now locked to a new address which corresponds to a new private key, and that changes the ownership. The coins haven't moved. They were on the blockchain in the beginning. They're still on the blockchain. What's changed is the ownership, which private keys control them, and those private keys may be on a hardware wallet somewhere. So how do you move them? Let's say you've bought coins in an exchange. Well, those are on the blockchain. They're on the blockchain controlled by keys that the exchange owns. You now have a hardware wallet that has keys that you control and own that you have backed up. So what do? Your hardware wallet can now generate a Bitcoin address that corresponds to one of the keys that is on that hardware wallet and backed up by your mnemonic phrase. Now, you can go to the exchange and select withdraw. Enter the Bitcoin address presented by your hardware wallet, and you only trust what you see on the screen of the hardware wallet, not on your laptop, not anywhere else. You must verify it because the screen is a secure element. And once you request that withdrawal, the exchange will construct a transaction, withdrawing money from the keys they control, and sending it to the address that corresponds to the keys you control. In fact, what you will likely see is a jumbo transaction with hundreds and hundreds of recipients because they batch all of their withdrawals. So your little amount going to your address will be one of 100 outputs in a single jumbo transaction that is paying withdrawals to hundreds of customers of that exchange every 10 minutes. And that transaction will effectively transfer control of that Bitcoin to an address that you have the keys on your hardware wallet. Now your hardware wallet will, talking to a software companion on your laptop or phone, will scan the blockchain for transactions involving that address. It will see the withdrawal from the exchange. It will go, aha, somebody sent money to a key that we control. And therefore it will tell you, you have balance. You have this amount of Bitcoin in your balance. The Bitcoin's still on the blockchain. It's not on the hardware wallet. The hardware wallet is simply telling the software on your online system which addresses to look for on the blockchain so that that system can tell you when you've received money. That's how you transfer coins to your own control. Bruno asks, how to be sure that the seed is not leaked from the software wallet? when I create a seed on a software wallet, let's say Mycelium, how do I know for sure that they don't keep it or leak it? Another question, is it possible to just see your hierarchical deterministic account on Mycelium without giving them the seed made from another wallet, let's say Samurai? Okay, let's break this into two sections. How do you know that a seed generated on a software wallet has not been leaked? Well, first of all, it's not generated by that company and given to you. It's generated on the software itself, and it's not given to anyone. The mnemonic phrase may be displayed on the screen for you to make a backup, but it doesn't leave that software application, or at least it shouldn't. Many of these software applications then use a hardware device that is found on smartphones called a secure element. This is an encrypted key store that is locked and encrypted by the Android or iOS operating system, and that's where these software applications store these things, not only so that they don't leak to the vendor or manufacturer of this software, but also so they can't leak through the memory of the operating system or into other applications stored on that smartphone. How good is that? Well, it's good enough for putting a small amount of cash, just as much as you would put a small amount of cash in the back pocket of your jeans in your physical leather wallet or purse. I would not put more than that. So I have a mnemonic backup phrase that I have recovered onto wallets that I have on my smartphone. In fact, I generally use the same seed for up to a dozen of different software wallets that I'm testing at any moment in time on my Android phone. I do not keep more than a couple $100 on there, just like I would not put more than a couple $100, and already that's a lot. I'm already sweating just thinking about that. I wouldn't put it in my leather wallet and walk around with that kind of cash in my pocket. Well, I wouldn't walk with that kind of cash on my smartphone either. Larger amounts, I only store in keys that are in a hardware wallet. And that's what I would do for amounts that I would use for, let's say, running my business or paying payroll every month. Now, beyond that, you can't make sure that your seed is not leaked from a software wallet. You can, however, know that many of these software wallets have the source code of that application published, audited, and reviewed, and they do something called a verifiable build. What does that mean? A verifiable build is when a third party builds the software from source code and then compares the checksum fingerprint of that software as published on the App Store with the checksum and fingerprint of the software that they built, the executable they built from the source code. Once they've done that, they're like, okay, what we see on the App Store, what I have installed on my phone, is the same binary, exactly, bit for bit, as the one I was able to independently build from the source code, and therefore I know exactly what's in it, whatever's in the source code. And of course you can review the source code, or some people can review the source code and ensure that the random number generator is correctly implemented and it doesn't leak information out of that application through a variety of mechanisms. But again, how much do you trust that? The problem is that these software applications are swimming in shark-infested waters. They're running on Android or Windows or Mac or iOS, general purpose operating systems that have hundreds of services, hundreds of libraries, and thousands of applications perhaps, or at least hundreds of applications running all kinds of things that are connected to the internet. The operating system itself may have vulnerabilities. The containerization of different applications on this operating system isn't watertight, isn't completely perfect. So one application can potentially leak to another application in user space. And of course, if there's a compromise of the operating system, then the operating system itself, compromised, can inspect the memory contents of different applications. There's all kinds of problems with that. This is why we use hardware wallets. Not because the hardware itself is magical in any way or more sophisticated than what your smartphone has. In fact, the opposite. It's less sophisticated. It's because the hardware wallet is a purpose-built device. It does one thing, not 100. It does one thing and one thing only in the most narrow way possible. It has a very simple screen, maybe 1 or 2 buttons. It has a very simple USB interface, and it has a very, very simple operating system that runs the screen, the buttons, and the USB interface separate from a secure element usually, or flash memory that contains your encrypted seed phrase, and all of that is done in highly specialized code that is very carefully inspected and audited to ensure it doesn't have vulnerabilities. And of course, hundreds of researchers look at these devices and attack them and find vulnerabilities, and then they get fixed and the firmware gets improved. So the reason hardware wallets are more secure is not because they can't leak keys. It's because they have so much less software and more specialized software that's running on them that they're much easier to audit so that we can make sure they're not leaking keys. They are under significantly more scrutiny, and they contain a very, very much smaller exposure or attack surface, as it's known in information security. The total amount of code that can have vulnerabilities and the proportion of that code that is on externally facing interfaces that can be attacked from, say, a compromised computer. They have very tight routines that do key generation and signing that are designed to not have various types of leakage of information through timing, power fluctuations, and other very esoteric types of attacks. So there is no perfect solution. But if you use the solution of hardware wallets that are designed for that purpose and that run minimal software on minimal hardware and are scrutinized heavily, you have the highest level of security. So where should you store your money? Small amounts? Sure, a smartphone is fine. Larger amounts? Definitely on a hardware wallet. And I never store money on third-party custodial accounts. You may not have the technical skill yet to move your money off those systems. As soon as you do, move your money off those systems, because not your keys, not your coins. On a similar question, second part of this question is it possible to just see your account on Mycelium without giving them the seed made from another wallet, let's say Samurai? Yes. And this is a very interesting and very, very important function of what hierarchical deterministic wallets, or HD wallets defined under the BIP32 standard, can do. What they can do is they can do independent derivation of the private keys and the public keys. And so therefore you can share a master key that is a public key only. This is called an extensible public key, or extended public key. This is a public key that can be used to derive all of the public keys in a series that belong to a specific account. But, and this is the important part, only the public keys. Only the Bitcoin addresses or Ethereum addresses or the public-facing information. The private keys are using a different derivation scheme and cannot be derived or reverse engineered. That effectively means that you have, as part of your seed, you can generate two components. One of which is a private key derivation component and one which is a public key derivation component, one which allows you to sign transactions and one which is read-only. It allows you to generate the addresses and instruct software to look on the blockchain and find out if those addresses have money and calculate the balance of your accounts. But the signing keys are not part of that. That branch cannot sign transactions. It's read-only, or as it's called in the industry, a watch-only wallet. In order to do this, you would use your hardware wallet and have it derive one of the account public keys for you. It starts with a prefix called XPUB, XPUB. And an XPUB for a specific account will be able to be used by online software to generate all of the Bitcoin addresses along that branch. This has two very useful cases. One is what we just described, which is the watch-only wallet. But the other thing you can do with this, of course, when you can generate Bitcoin addresses, that means you can generate addresses to which you can receive money, but not spend. So you can use that, your watch-only wallet, which might be on a smartphone, to generate addresses so that people could send you payments, but the thing that's on your smartphone, which is less secure, can't sign transactions. That's on a hardware wallet. And that means that you can receive money anytime you want without pulling out your hardware wallet, simply by doing it with a piece of software that uses this extended public key, and you have your keys safely in the hardware wallet. Another very good use of this is e-commerce. I have a shop, and that shop is running next to a web server inside the same operating system as a web server, and is connected to the internet. People come and they put things in a cart, and then they click checkout, and then they select pay with Bitcoin. Well, here's the thing. That is an internet exposed device running a lot of software. Do I want to put private keys on that? Absolutely not. It is very unsafe to put private keys on that. So how does my web server know how to generate Bitcoin addresses? Simple. I have installed an XPUB into a piece of software that generates a new Bitcoin address for every cart. And then it keeps track of those. And if it sees a payment come in on one of those Bitcoin addresses, it's like, great, checkout complete, order processed, ship the item. But there's no money on that server. There are no private keys that can sign on that server. You compromise it, you can get all of the Bitcoin addresses and look at all of the transactions I've received, but that's about it. It's an information loss, not a funds loss. And effectively, the only way to spend from those keys is for me to pull out my hardware wallet, which I have to do every now and then. If someone on the store requests a refund, I have to pull out the hardware wallet to sign a transaction to refund, because the keys are not on the store. I hope this explains how this works. All right. Can nodes on the network steal keys? Since nodes, do they have access to the private key and public key? How is this information protected so they're not stolen from the node validating the transaction? Diana, nodes see as part of the transaction the public key that they need to use to validate the signature. Because when you sign a transaction with a digital signature, you include the public key so they can confirm that you are in fact the authorized owner of that Bitcoin address. And so nodes, yes, they see the public key in the transaction. Everybody sees the public key. That's why we call it public. And they see that as part of the transaction when you produce a digital signature. That's inside the transaction. And so to validate the transaction, the node will compare the transaction, the public key, and the signature, and confirm that those things add up correctly to a valid digital signature. But of course, they don't have private keys. You don't put private keys on nodes, although some nodes can have a wallet, and that wallet can be a hot wallet where you put private keys on it. This is not a good idea. It's not a good idea because now you're putting private keys on an internet-connected device that manages a hot wallet that's talking to the internet. In fact, it's talking to the internet over the Bitcoin protocol. An example of that would be the Bitcoin Core or Bitcoin QT wallet. Now, you can run a wallet in that software, but that's not advisable. It's not advisable because it's a hot wallet. So what you would do is you would have the private keys on a hardware wallet, as I've recommended many times already, and the node itself cannot compromise any of the information. We do not trust nodes. We don't even trust our own nodes, let alone other people's nodes. All right. Nick has a really interesting question. Understanding wallets and Bitcoin addresses. Nick asks, each time I purchase Bitcoin on an exchange and transfer it to a cold wallet, it is sent to an address on the wallet with an amount of Bitcoin or Satoshis. Let's say 0.0015 Bitcoin, which is what, 1.5 million Satoshis. If I do this each week for 10 weeks, I have purchased, let's say, 0.015 Bitcoin in 10 different transactions. Now, if I wanted to send out that 0.01 Bitcoin to a friend, is it one transaction of 0.01 Bitcoin, or is it multiple smaller transactions, so 6 transactions of 0.0015 Bitcoin? Are the fees applied per transaction? Do I spend more to send 6 times 0.0, etc., etc.? This is a really good question, Nick, because the answer is counterintuitive, but here's how it works. Transactions spend inputs and produce outputs. Outputs, or unspent transaction outputs, UTXO, you may have heard that acronym, are the fundamental spending unit on the blockchain. So Bitcoin is always stored in indivisible chunks of Bitcoin, and these chunks, called outputs, unspent outputs are called UTXO, spent outputs are called just TXO. Transaction outputs are the unit that that a transaction produces and spends. So if you were to do 10 withdrawals from an exchange to your hardware wallet, you would produce 10 distinct, unique transaction outputs of the smaller amount, 1.5 million Satoshis. Now, in order to spend a larger amount than each one of these units, a transaction would be created that would combine 10 units as inputs and spend to 1, or if you have changed, 2 or more units of outputs on the other side of the transaction. So a transaction consumes the inputs, adding up all of their value, and produces outputs that pay different destination addresses. It doesn't matter if you sent this to one address 10 times or you sent it to 10 addresses 1 time each. Regardless of whether you use the same or different address, they are stored as 10 indivisible and distinguishable chunks of 1.5 million Satoshis, not one big chunk of 15 million Satoshis. So when you try to spend a large amount, you will produce a transaction that has 6 or 10 inputs, regardless of which addresses you sent it to. In fact, your wallet doesn't track a balance. There is no balance on the blockchain. What your wallet does is it looks at all the keys it controls and all of the addresses it controls, and then it scans the blockchain to count how many outputs of unique amounts of Bitcoin you have under any of these addresses. And then it keeps track of these outputs. And these outputs may come in different sizes. And to construct a transaction, just like opening your purse and saying, oh, I need to buy something that costs $1.25. Well, I have 2 quarters, 3 dimes, 5 nickels, 17 pennies. You would basically say, let me construct a combination of these different units that is more than or equal to the amount I want to pay and get change for the rest. That's how the UTXO model works in Bitcoin. And as a result, you would pay a transaction fee that would reflect a large transaction containing 6 or 10 inputs. You wouldn't need to do 6 transactions, just 1, but that transaction would be large. Each of those inputs would have a signature. If they're all in the same Bitcoin address, the signature would be signing with the same public key, but it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter to the blockchain. If it was 10 different addresses, you'd have signatures and 10 different public keys. it would be the same size regardless, and you would pay a higher fee. Not exactly 10 times higher than if you only had a single unit of Bitcoin to spend, because there's other parts of the transaction, but certainly it will be 800%, 600%, 700% bigger in size than the fee that you would spend if you had all of that in one unit. So how do you get around this? Well, one of the ways you get around this is, let's say you're dollar cost averaging and you're buying these amounts once a week. Well, you don't withdraw them immediately as you buy them. It's better to wait, and then once you have accumulated a small amount, then maybe once a month you do one withdrawal, and that creates one larger unit or chunk of Bitcoin value that is sent to one of your addresses, and then that would be one input in a transaction, and that wouldn't bloat up your transaction. If you create lots of fragmentation, then you end up with high fees. Now, there are ways to fix this, of course. If you find that your wallet generally it's producing giant transactions with very high fees, that's because you fragmented it into tiny, tiny chunks of Bitcoin. What you can do is effectively you can defragment your wallet. You wait until the blockchain is very quiet and fees are at the lowest level possible. You then make a single transaction paying yourself to a Bitcoin address that you own a large amount that consolidates many of these smaller fragments into one. Now, you're going to pay a fee, but you can lowball that fee. You can say 1 Satoshi per byte. And then you might have to wait. It might take 3, 4, 5, 10 days for that transaction to get through. But once it gets through, you've now taken maybe 30 or 40 tiny chunks of Bitcoin value, and you've effectively consolidated them into one big chunk, which is the single output value that you created in that transaction. And you've just defragmented your wallet. People do that. Of course, if you fragment it really, really small, there's a possibility that no matter what you do, the fees to actually spend that exceed the value of the fragment. And that is what we call dust in Bitcoin. Now, dust may become better than dust in the future as the Bitcoin price goes up. Of course, things that previously were not affordable to spend are now affordable to spend during a low fee time because it's worth more money. But there are levels of dust where no amount of price appreciation is going to make them spendable on chain. All right, I think we've covered a lot of material. Maybe time for a great question from Stella. Sending Bitcoin from a hardware wallet. Let's say you own BTC and like to pay for services. You have a hardware wallet that keeps your keys. How do you go about sending the required payment? Does the wallet provide an online application that you use? Yes. You have to think about a wallet as consisting of primarily 4 fundamental functions. Those 4 functions are: a wallet generates keys. That's the first thing you do when you initialize it. Whether it's software or hardware, it will generate keys. And it does this with a random number generator that produces a random number for your keys or your seed. It then stores keys. It generates and stores keys. That's function number 1. The second function that the wallet does is it uses those keys to sign transactions. And that's a function that has to be done on a secure device because that requires a private key. Then there's 2 other functions. A wallet constructs transactions. So speaking of what we just spoke about, the different chunks of Bitcoin that are stored against your various addresses, well, your wallet keeps track of all of these chunks of Bitcoin. Just like when you open your purse and you look inside and you say, I have 3/4, 27 dimes, 17 nickels and 134 pennies. What can I buy? And then you have a classic problem, which is, I want to spend $1.75. How many of these coins do I need to put together? In which combinations? And what's the best strategy for doing that, so that I have a good balance of small values and large values, and I don't end up with too many pennies and end up carrying a sack of coins, but I also don't end up with too many quarters, because then I can't break change and it becomes more complicated. How do I balance this? And every wallet will do it differently. It's a classic optimization problem. That's the concept of constructing a transaction. And then there's the fourth function, which is monitoring the blockchain. And here, your wallet is looking at all of the transactions that are happening on the blockchain, either because it has a copy of the entire blockchain and all transactions, or because it's talking to a server that does have a copy of all of the transactions on the blockchains. And it looks for transactions that mention an address that it knows belongs to this wallet. So it's basically got a watch list. It's like, here are 1,000 addresses that I know I control and I've used in the past. I'm monitoring them to see any payment to them, and also to keep track of what unspent chunks of Bitcoin belong to any of these addresses that are available to me for spending, for constructing transactions by combining them in different combinations. So, generate and store keys, sign transactions, construct transactions, monitor the blockchain. Well, now if you notice, two of these things, generate and store keys, sign transactions, involve private keys and are very, very sensitive operations. These get done by the hardware wallet. Then you have two functions, which are construct transactions based on chunks of Bitcoin that are available on the blockchain for me to spend, and of course then broadcast those transactions so that we can create new ones, and monitor the blockchain for payments and for whatever chunks of Bitcoin we own on the blockchain. Now, these two functions require online access but do not require private keys. And this exactly is the split between hardware wallets and their software companion, the piece of software that helps them do their job. Now, let's say you have a Trezor hardware wallet. Well, then the software companion that you would most likely use at first is Trezor.io, which is the website, and it has an interface. What does that do? It constructs transactions and broadcasts them, and it monitors the blockchain. And once it's constructed a transaction, it will send it over the USB cable to your hardware wallet. Your hardware wallet will verify all of the information. It will display it on the secure screen so you can confirm you're paying the correct address, the correct amount, with the correct fee, and you only trust what you see on the screen. And when you press the button and sign, it will then transmit the signed transaction back to the software companion to broadcast onto the Bitcoin blockchain so that that transaction becomes valid. Now, if you have a ledger, you might use Ledger Live, but this is very important. Pay attention here. You do not have to use the vendor's software. In fact, I don't. Why? A couple of reasons. The first reason is privacy. In order for that software to monitor the blockchain, it does take an XPub, an extended public key, from which it generates all your Bitcoin addresses so that it can go and monitor the blockchain for you and scan it for recent transactions. And this involves sending some information to the servers of that company in order to check various addresses. Now, these companies don't want to keep IP addresses. They don't want to create associations between who's looking at what Bitcoin addresses and why, for now. But you never know what might leak from that kind of activity. So from a privacy perspective, that's not a very good choice. The other reason I don't use those is because those applications are generally not the best software wallets out there. So I prefer software wallets that have sophisticated functions for managing fees, things like replace by fee and child pays for parent. Sophisticated coin selection algorithms that combine the quarters, the dimes, the nickels in such a way as to not leave too many trails and make too many obvious fingerprints as to what wallets I'm using and why. Not associating too many addresses together, leaving a statistical pattern on the blockchain that others can check. Also, maintaining the good health of my wallet by ensuring I have a good combination of large and small chunks of Bitcoin available to me to construct transactions. Finally, I prefer software companions to my hardware wallet that use my own Bitcoin node, which receives all transactions and all blocks, and therefore when I ask it for my addresses, it doesn't tell anyone what addresses I'm interested in. That's an internal question that stays on my node, and as a result I have much better privacy. So, a hardware wallet always has a software companion that does the transaction construction and it does the blockchain monitoring. You can use the manufacturer's solution, but fortunately, there is a fairly consistent standard for the language used over the USB interface that supports at least a dozen different common hardware wallets. So Trezor, Ledger, Keep, Key, Cold Card, etc., are often supported. And they're supported through this hardware wallet interface on a dozen or 2 dozen or 3 dozen wallets. And not just Bitcoin wallets, also Ethereum wallets and Monero wallets and all kinds of other wallets. So the companion software you use is up to you. You can do better than the manufacturer's software. You can get more sophisticated, perhaps not as easy to use, but more sophisticated software companions, and they can interface with your hardware wallet for the function of, here's a transaction, sign it, thank you so much, now I'll broadcast it, which is a fairly simple function and has become increasingly standardized over the years. This will allow you to unleash the capabilities of your hardware wallet and use it with a variety of software. For example, I will take my single hardware wallet. I don't need to trust the software companion. I only trust what I see on the screen. I will use it with the Trezor website. I'll use it with the Ledger companion software. I'll use it with Electrum desktop. I'll use it with Blockstream Green address. I'll use it with Ethereum wallets like MyEther wallet, MyCrypto, MetaMask, and various wallets like that. I might use it with a privacy-focused software companion like Wasabi desktop wallet. I'll use it in combination with my e-commerce store like the BTC Pay server. A single hardware wallet talking to all of these different software interfaces, none of which I trust. I always check what's on the screen, but that really opens up the power. And it also means that if a function isn't available, like you're having a problem with fees and your wallet doesn't really do fees very well, the hardware wallet can talk to a different piece of software that is better at fees and better at construction management. So you can get yourself out of a sticky situation sometimes doing that. And that's a great question to end on. Thank you so much, Stella. What fantastic questions we had. This was week 4 of the 15th semester of the massive open online course for the University of Nicosia's master's degree in digital currencies. I'm your teacher, Andreas M. Antonopoulos. I am delighted to answer these fantastic questions you've asked me. Now, do your homework for next week. Next week, we're doing Bitcoin in Practice Part 2. I believe, and that will be coming up live for Q&A next Thursday. And remember to ask your questions in advance on the forum, both so you can have discussion with your colleagues and so we can prepare all of these questions and provide great answers to you. Thank you so much for watching. Do your homework. See you next week. Bye-bye.